Financial is one of them, but what are some of the other things, David, that where the culture clashes?
Another one that's very common is some companies operate with a blame-based culture, so that if there's a problem, they're quick to look for somebody to blame for it. And there are others that operate with a solution-based culture.
Welcome to the Fueling Deals Podcast, the podcast that teaches how to accelerate your business growth through all types of deals. It's time to fuel up, so buckle in with your host, Corey Kupfer.
There are only two ways to grow your business: organically through sales, marketing, providing great service, etc., and inorganically through deals. Too many companies focus only on the first way, organic growth. Welcome to the podcast, which will help accelerate your business growth inorganically. My guests are a huge variety of deal makers and experts on all types of deals who have a personal experience that can help you grow, get clear, learn best practices, and avoid mistakes. We discuss everything from large, complex mergers and acquisitions to smaller deals that you can do even without significant capital. My guest today is David Shriner-Cahn. David is a recognized authority on entrepreneurship, leadership development, and the host of the business podcast, Smashing the Plateau. Featured in Forbes Magazine, 3 podcasts to power up your ultra lean business, and Inc. Magazine's 5 entrepreneurs that will change the way you communicate. Over 400 episodes of Smashing the Plateau offer a wealth of personal experiences and practical advice to help lead your business through challenging transitions. David, it's so great to have you here on the show.
Thank you, Corey. It's great to be here.
So, David, I know, we're going to talk a little bit about, what you do and your great podcast and then definitely about your experience in working with people on integrating mergers post, and other combinations post-merger, because that's so important. But before we do that, I want to take you back and ask, what did you want to be when you were a little kid? Because my guess is it wasn't doing what you do now, and certainly wasn't being a podcast host, because when you and I grew up, there was no such thing as podcasts. So
no, but there were radio shows. Which
absolutely.
Really, a podcast is basically like it's a radio show that's listen on demand.
Absolutely. So is that, did you know you wanted to do something like that when you were a kid, or was,
Yeah, you've got to be kidding, Corey. I was for sure not. And in reality, I was pretty clueless of what I wanted to do when I, quote, grew up. Many, many years later, I'm still working on that. I believe life is a work in progress. And truth be told, I've had basically numerous careers in quite different sectors.
That's great. So what was your first, however you define this, what was your first real business?
So my first real business as an entrepreneur was relatively recently. It's sort of the more recent chapter in my my professional career, which was about 12 years ago when I launched a one-person consulting business.
Great. And tell me a little bit about that and how it evolved.
It evolved because I frankly wanted to do something where I was in charge. And I had spent, at that point, I'd been in the working world for close to 30 years. The first part was in the corporate sector, working as an engineer. The second part was in the nonprofit sector, in various kinds of leadership and management roles. And especially, and actually in both cases, I was interacting with a lot of consultants. I had hired plenty of consultants in my career, and I thought, you know what, if I really just want to do my own thing, I'll be a consultant. So it was no more complicated than that in terms of like the decision-making process. The reality is, being an entrepreneur, even if you're still basically working with the same kinds of organizations that you work with as an employee, and if you're in the same field that you were in as an employee, still working in your own business is very different than working in somebody else's business or organization.
Yeah, no question about that. I've been an entrepreneur for over 30 years, and most of my clients and our listeners some are business executives working at other places. But the entrepreneurial journey is definitely a different road.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I also find that when I'm in the advice giving role, that people who are on the other side of the conversation generally fall into either the entrepreneurship world or the employee world. I find that there's not a whole lot that's in between.
Absolutely. So, David, tell us a little bit more about how things have evolved, what you're doing now in terms of your core business, and definitely about your podcast.
Sure. So my business, and one of the things about having a small business is that you have the ability to make some pretty major transformations in your business in response to what's going on in the marketplace. And so initially, my work as an independent consultant was primarily with the kinds of organizations that I had been part of in the nonprofit sector. So I'm doing a lot of nonprofit management work. I started to be asked by small businesses for the same kinds of help and ended up becoming much more involved in the kind of work that we do that's in the private sector. And also made a pretty conscious decision, I don't know, maybe 6 years ago or so, to start doing some content creation because I saw that others that were doing things that I thought were interesting and gaining some recognition were involved in content marketing. So we started a blog, and then the blog, after a couple of years, moved into a podcast because the interview format was one that actually works well for the kind of work that we do, and also it works well for my own personal skills. And the podcast actually turned out to be a great medium for connecting with people, both guests and the audience. And I really like doing it. So it's one of the, it's sort of like you, if you find something that you like doing and is serving a purpose, then it's more likely that you're going to do it consistently.
Well, talking about consistently, I mean, you're over 400 episodes in, and everybody should check out Smashing the Plateau, that the podcast. And for people that don't know the podcast world, 400 episodes in is a huge accomplishment. I mean, many people. There are many examples of people who start podcasts and do 6 or 8 or 12 or 15 episodes and then stop. So, so somebody, has 400 episodes and, the quality of type of podcast that David's done is doing something right. So you should definitely check it out.
Yeah, I would say you're totally right, Corey. The average podcaster does way fewer than 24 episodes and generally doesn't last more than 6 months. Right.
And listen, it's interesting for me as somebody, and we'll jump into the deal conversation in a moment. But it's interesting to me as an entrepreneur who is, earlier in my podcast journey. I feel like it's the same thing when I wrote my book a couple of years ago, Authentic Negotiating. Most people don't know that most books sell under 300 copies. So the average book sells under 300 copies, and 98% of the books, something like that, sell under 1,000 copies. And so the same thing happens with authors, right? They either claim they're going to write a book and they don't, or they write a book and then they don't do anything with it. They don't understand how the model works. And so one of the things I did when I wrote the book, similar to when I spent over a year and a half studying the podcast model before I decided to launch, because, when I do something, I'm not going to do 8 or 12 episodes. I'm going to be at 400 at some point, David. I just need some time.
Yes, you will be. And people who ask me about podcasting and what it takes to be a successful podcaster, and my answer is there are actually, I think, 3 components that are the most important: frequency, consistency, and quality, and in that order.
Right, which is really fascinating that it's in that order, right? So let's jump over and talk about, because one of the things that you and I had a little bit of a exchange about was something that's super, super important in the deal world that's often overlooked. So, one of the things that I talk to entrepreneurs about is, and you can hear it in my intro, is that too many firms actually don't even take advantage of the possibility of doing deals. They struggle to grow organically, or they don't grow as fast as they want, and they don't understand that there are all types of deals that can be done. And then the question beyond that, though, is if you're going to do deals, how do you do them successfully? And obviously that involves due diligence up front and structuring the deal right and pricing it right and all that kind of good stuff. The often overlooked thing is what happens after the deal closes, and what are the things you need to be concerned about then. what are the things that some companies do right, and where are the pitfalls and problems that a lot of companies run into post-deal.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you're focusing on this, Corey, because I think it is one of the most important aspects of success related to a deal. And if you look at the statistics, something like 80% of mergers and acquisitions are not successful. And it's generally not because of the financial terms of the deal. It's usually for other reasons.
So yeah, talk to me about some of the other reasons that you see come up.
It's the people. Whenever you're doing a deal that is either a merger or an acquisition, and in reality, every merger is probably really an acquisition anyway, because one culture ends up predominating more than likely. What you're doing is you are combining cultures. And if you think about it, like one common definition of culture is the way people behave when nobody's watching. So if you think about the average employee or the average customer, how is it that they behave in relation to the company when nobody is watching? And if there are differences in the way different groups of people behave, particularly significant differences, what are the consequences?
So let's break down some of those differences. I mean, I remember one example. It's interesting for me because, in my role as a lawyer and a consultant and things like that on deals, my job is largely to help the clients get the deal done if they want to get it done. And I'm looking to not be one of those lawyers, right? Lawyers get a reputation of being deal killers, and frankly, lawyers bristle at that. But there's actually some good reasons why a lot of my colleagues are deemed that way. But at the same time, I do raise these issues with clients, and I remember one deal that I had where it was so clear to me that the cultures were going to clash. They were both very successful in their business. One had a scrimp and save and keep expenses super low culture, and the other company had a spend money to make money, travel first class, entertain clients culture. And I remember sitting them down in a room, just asking them questions, not because I was looking to kill a deal, but because I wanted to make sure they weren't going to do a deal that would then end up going bad. And asking questions like, okay, your leases are up. What kind of office space, do you all want? Have you talked about what your, client entertainment budgets are going to be? And, long story short, they sort of figured out on their own, with a little subtle prompting from me, that their cultures would never fit together. So, financial is one of them. But what are some of the other things, David, that where the culture clashes?
Another one that's very common is some companies operate with a blame-based culture, so that if there's a problem, they're quick to look for somebody to blame for it. And there are others that operate with a solution-based culture. So if there's a problem, our job is to look for a solution so that either we can solve what's going on right now, or if it's not solvable in this instance, we'll learn from what happened so that we are less likely to have the same problem again.
That's a great one. And I'm wondering whether, obviously the companies that have a solution-based culture, I'm sure are happy to talk about that and whatever. But the companies that have a blame-based culture, how do you really, first of all, do they admit that? And how does one determine that? And, if you're working with somebody on that, how do you address that?
Well, it really requires some careful listening. And one of the things that we do when we work with companies that are going through a major transformation, often due to a merger or an acquisition, is to speak to as many people one-on-one as possible in a non-judgmental way so that we can learn what their fears are. And a blame-based culture creates a lot of fear.
Yeah.
Right, because people they're afraid that they're going to get blamed, so they're reluctant to take any kind of steps that will get them noticed. They're afraid, which also, it doesn't help with things like trying to be innovative.
Yeah, and what's interesting to me is that that concept of creating a culture that has a lot of fear in it, even when two good companies are merging or combining in some way, or there's an acquisition, there's always fear just related to the change involved on both sides. And certainly if it's a smaller company being acquired by a larger one, or, where the integration is into, from company A into company B, where certainly on the side of company A, there's a lot of uncertainty, which causes fear already. So when you add that to the fear you're talking about, I'm sure it causes a lot of problems.
Yeah. Another method that can help determine what's going on is management by walking around. So for the CEO or people in the C-suite to have blocks of time that are not scheduled with strategic decision making, but where they actually spend time walking around, getting to know employees at all levels of the company, getting to know customers at all levels, and listening to what they're hearing from employees and listening to what they're hearing from customers. That's really important. They'll get some important clues. Too often, especially in bigger companies, the people higher up in the food chain are way too removed from what's going on at the ground level.
No question about that. And I guess that raises a challenge on a deal. So if somebody's trying to do due diligence on the other side, on the company you're going to be acquired by or acquire or merge into, there's always a sensitivity about how much access that company's going to give you to their rank and file employees and, beyond the executive management. And so do you have any suggestions on how a potential deal partner in advance, in the due diligence phase would try to determine some of these cultural things to try to avoid the pitfalls?
Yeah, I mean, you could ask the questions of the people that you are communicating with, because presumably you're communicating with a very small number of people at the top, but you could ask them questions about what kinds of information gathering do you typically do in your company? Information gathering from employees, information gathering from customers. Have you ever brought on outside consultants to do some of the information gathering? So it's a third party. Do you have simple things like regular performance reviews? How do you handle them? And as part of your performance review, is it just you dictating to the employees what you think they're doing wrong or where they need to improve, or are you listening to what they're telling you about not only how they want to grow personally and professionally, but also what they're seeing as both the opportunities and the risks that the business as a whole is going through?
Any other thoughts, just tips or pitfalls that you see in these kind of things when either companies come together, or even listen? I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be a merger or acquisition. Sometimes people are bringing in key management. Sometimes people are doing some sort of strategic joint venture with another entity, and these kind of issues come up in those situations as well, right?
Yeah. So be really clear on why changes are being made, and make sure you communicate that to everybody who's involved, and not just once, but multiple ways, because people absorb information differently. So emails, other kinds of internal communications, external communications, sometimes social media is appropriate, particularly if you're talking about interactions with customers. Sending around information by paper is important. Having an opportunity to have group discussions and individual discussions with employees and customers about any kinds of changes, to make sure people really understand the rationale for the change, and that their fears are allayed. Because the biggest problem is when there are fears that are not being addressed, and people will spend a lot of time dwelling on their fears, not being productive. And what you don't want to have happen, particularly when you're talking about any kind of major change, whether it's bringing on new management or a merger or acquisition, you don't want to have your best people afraid to stay in the company and to start shopping around for new jobs.
That's great advice, and I want to sort of bring this down because a lot of what we've been alluding to is how we deal with employees and and messaging and in bigger companies and bigger cultures. But there are smaller deals that are done as well, where you raise something. The first thing I said to you is when I said what's the biggest issue in terms of bringing two companies together, and you said the people, and that applies whether it's hundreds or thousands or whether it's three. So I guess an area I'd love to hear about, I'm sure you run into, is let's say even we have a smaller deal where the people involved are the ones negotiating. So, you have a couple of people here or there. Talk to me a little bit about, I guess I would call it self-awareness, right? Because people don't necessarily even necessarily understand themselves and how it will work in combination with someone else. Partnerships aren't easy. So give me your thoughts on that.
Well, yeah, you're touching on a very important point. We had a situation where we were working with a client that was a small company and had an opportunity to buy a competitor, which they did, basically doubled in size. And not only were there lots of fears among the employees, there were also fears among the partnership level of the two companies. And one of the risks for the acquiring company was loss of talent of the previous owners of the company being acquired. One of the important factors, you have a lot of tacit knowledge that's part of owners of small companies, and you don't want to lose that immediately when the company gets acquired. So making sure that there was a smooth transition and integration of the what ended up being multiple owners post acquisition was really important. And we did that with a lot of one-on-one discussions to try to understand what the people involved were feeling and thinking.
Yeah, I think people underestimate sometimes. I mean, certainly people in my profession, and lawyers, also maybe accountants, investment bankers, whatever, who are more looking at the structure of deals and the numbers in deals and the, things like that. How important some of this psychology is. I mean, I've had deals where the seller ends up getting cold feet because psychologically they're not really willing to sell. And I won't go into a lot of examples, but I'd love to hear if you have any. Where for example, we were able to get a deal done that was basically on the rocks, not because of anything in the structure, whatever. It was because the owner really realized that he couldn't fully give up his baby, and when we let him keep a corner office and always come in and play some, made him the executive chair and had him still be able to interact with his top 5 clients, the deal got done. Whereas honestly, without that, it doesn't matter how much money was on the table, it wouldn't have gotten done. So, any examples or thoughts you have around sort of that psychology that happens with owners of businesses and executives?
Yeah, the psychology is really important. So you have clients that have long-standing relationships with these owners, and you don't want the clients to leave because that's part of the value of acquiring the company. So making sure that the owner who is selling the company is able to maintain the relationships with clients long enough and begin to transition them to the new owners, that's really important. And very often, they're not only business relationships, they're personal relationships, especially when you have clients that may go back decades. So what can you do so that the owner who is selling the company feels like the clients that he or she has nurtured for decades are going to be well taken care of? There's a lot of psychology involved in that. Same thing is also true with employees. They may have employees that they have had, especially if you're talking about a small company, the company with, a dozen, 2 dozen employees. Very often those employees have been with the company for decades, and they're close personal relationships. It's not just a business relationship. So for the owner to feel comfortable that I'm turning over my employees to somebody new to be in charge, that's not easy to do. And what do you need to do so that that owner will feel comfortable turning over the authority for that relationship to somebody new? Do you need to give that person an office where he or she can come in on a regular basis to interact with the employees, to feel confident that the employees are being taken care of? These are all very complex issues, and psychology is a really important part of it.
So when companies bring you in, do you find more, are you coming in after the deal is done and they're figuring out that they have a bunch of these problems, or are companies smart enough to bring somebody like you in advance to help them identify and get ahead of these problems?
Well, sort of like going to the physician. Do you go in for your annual exam and start to plan ahead? Or do you wait until you start to feel aches and pains and you look for therapy? Way too often, people are reactive as opposed to being proactive. I wish that more people were proactive, but they are not necessarily.
Well, I didn't know what your answer was going to be, but I sort of knew what your answer was going to be, because that's human nature and that's my experience. So listen, listeners out there, one of the things that is crucial in having a merger work, and when I say work, that means doing, it's everything from choosing the right deal, structuring it properly, doing the right due diligence, and then integrating it properly in the back end, which includes, by the way, things we're not talking about, like proper technology integration and a million other things, but certainly the cultural integration. The more that you can anticipate and get ahead of these things and bring in the right professionals, like somebody like David, it really makes sense, because trust me, it will save you whatever money you spend up front. It will save you way more in the back end, and have the chances of your deal being successful be much, much higher.
Yeah, that's for sure, Corey.
Yeah, and you're right, David. So few people do that, and that's why a lot of deals do go bad. But just so we're not only focusing on all of what can go wrong, I'm sure, and I would hope that you've seen opportunities where companies have done it right, potentially with your help or otherwise, and there's been huge advantages of doing a deal, right?
Right. So the situation that I mentioned earlier about the small company that acquired another company, both companies had been around for certainly more than 2 decades. I think perhaps more than 3. Many of the employees had been around for a decade or more, if not 2 decades or more. And like many small companies, a lot of the knowledge was in people's heads. There wasn't a huge amount that was documented, unlike bigger companies. And we made some steps that were actually really helpful in providing a smooth transition. We came up with a communication plan so that all of the employees really understood why this acquisition was taking place. And we made sure that there was a clear structure in place for all of the employees post-acquisition, so that they knew where they fit in the new company, because there was some rearrangement. And we were also dealing with multiple geographic locations. We created a personal relationship building program for employees, because just like in any other situation in business, people want to do business with those they know, like, and trust. And that's true in the same company between employees. Employees will want to work with and be helpful to other employees when they know, like, and trust them. And you do that through building personal relationships. We actually created a program for that. We created a timetable and made sure that we had a project manager for any kind of significant change, even little things like, we had to integrate the phone systems. So we needed to have somebody who was in charge of the plan to integrate the phone systems. And that meant there was also a point person anybody with a question could ask about what's going to be happening with my phone. So there are some little things that turned out to be very helpful to really make this work smoothly.
And it sounds like it turned into a successful deal.
It was a very successful deal, and the company's doing quite well.
That's great. That's a great example. So, David, before I ask you my last question, I just want to make sure, I mean, we're going to have it in the show notes, but what's the best place for people to contact you and find out more information about you?
They can go to actually the website for our podcast, smashingtheplateau.com. There's a get in touch form on the site. They can fill out the information there. They can also email me, David at smashingtheplateau.com, or call our office. We have live humans who answer the phone during business hours Eastern time, 212-731-0770.
Well, that's great. So listen, listeners, obviously, I think you get a great feel for the way David and his team can help your company if you're doing a deal or even if you're not, because a lot of these issues he raised is not only in connection with deals getting done. So definitely reach out to him. Definitely check out the podcast. And David, my final question for you is, so one of the things that I'm really committed to is inspiring authenticity in business. And for me, authenticity is not just the conversation of integrity. It's really the conversation of alignment, right? So, I'm sure when you work with entrepreneurs and business executives, having their business decisions and their decisions on growth or culture or whatever be in alignment with who they are, their inner truth, what their values are is important. And I find that on deals, that's very significant as well. So I'd love to hear, and a lot of things you've said address this, but I'd love to hear, whether it's for your clients or really, I'd be really interested in for you, how do you make sure that you stay in an authentic place and make your own, your decisions in your business, and how you advise clients come from that authentic place aligned with your values?
Well, there are a couple of things you could do. One is you can just ask each person who is a stakeholder to write a value statement and compare them and see if they look like they're pretty much in sync or not. And if they're not, then it's a problem. Another thing that I often do with clients is to ask them to map their clients based on two criteria. One is how profitable they are, and the second is how easy it is to work with them. And if you plot them out on a grid, you'll find that there's some portion of your clients that are not so profitable and they're not so great to work with. And the reality is this not so great to work with part has a lot to do with the values not being in sync. And what you should do every so often is look at your client list and take that bottom, some small percentage from the bottom of the ones that are not so profitable and not so easy to work with, and refer them to somebody else.
Absolutely. There's somebody they belong working with, not you, right?
Correct.
That's great. Well, listen, David, thank you so much for being on the show. And thank you, Fueling Deals listeners, for tuning in. Remember, there's only one difference between companies that grow inorganically and those that don't. And it's unrelated to the size, amount of capital, or any other factor other than owners and executives of companies that do deals make a decision to do deals, and then they take action. Well, it's time to refuel. So until next week, Corey Kupfer signing out.
Thank you again for tuning in. Be sure to leave Fueling Deals a rating and review on iTunes and Google. Check out all our episodes at fuelingdeals.com to find out more resources to accelerate your business growth.